Robert Murphy has a great anecdote in his book, A Diplomat Among Warriors. Murphy was the Assistant Secretary of State for United Nations Affairs in the Dwight Eisenhower administration. And he relates how in 1953, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles ordered America's ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge II, to vote yes on a proposed resolution relating to the Korean War. Upon reading in the newspapers that Lodge had voted no, Murphy put through an urgent call to the ambassador in New York. And when Lodge picked up the phone, Murphy said, quote, "Apparently our instructions failed to reach you," end quote. And Lodge replied, quote, "Instructions? I'm not bound by instructions from the State Department. I'm a member of the president's cabinet. I accept instructions only from him," end quote. Murphy protested, quote, "You're an ambassador. Our ambassadors accept instructions from the Secretary of State," end quote. Lodge apparently yawned and then said, quote, "I take note of the department's opinions," end quote. Murphy, nonplussed, declared, quote, "I hardly think that's good enough. This is a new situation for me, and I'll have to bring it to the Secretary's attention," end quote. Lodge replied airily, quote, "Yes, you do that. He will set you right," end quote. As remarkable as that exchange was what happened afterwards. When a boiling mad Murphy told Dulles about Lodge's misconduct, Dulles thought about it for a moment and then said, quote, "This is one of those awkward situations which requires special consideration. If it happens again, just tell me and I'll take care of it," end quote. Murphy recalls, quote, "We never gave any further orders to Lodge or even suggestions. Lodge interpreted his functions as much broader than those of an ordinary ambassador. He believed that his position in New York entitled him to help formulate policy as well as execute it," end quote. In that regard, Henry Cabot Lodge II was representative of a tradition in U.S. statecraft that I call rogue diplomacy, a bold, even cocky rebelliousness that is uniquely American. No other nation's foreign service can claim such a remarkable track record of diplomats telling their bosses to go to hell. My book examines that record through a case study approach. Each of its chapters addresses a milepost in U.S. foreign relations, the American Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican War, World War I, World War II, and the 1963 coup in South Vietnam. My organization is chronological, and the thread holding these foreign policy turning points together is the rogue diplomat, the policymaker who becomes a law unto himself and whose vision is not only influential, but decisive. I argue that many of the most important political, territorial, economic, and geostrategic triumphs enjoyed by the United States during its first 200 years of national existence came about because an American diplomat disobeyed orders. The spectacularly generous terms granted the fledgling republic by Great Britain after the Revolutionary War, the acquisition of half a continent via the Louisiana Purchase, the seizure of a comparably vast expanse of land from Mexico in 1848, the preservation of Anglo-American ties in the years leading up to U.S. co-belligerency in World War I, these and other watersheds in the history of U.S. foreign relations derived in great part from the refusal of ambassadors, envoys, and other diplomatic agents to follow the instructions given them by their superiors back home. And when I say disobeyed, I mean disobeyed. American diplomats did not misunderstand their orders or fail to receive them. They struck out on courses that they knew were contrary to Washington's wishes, but that they felt were in the best interest of their country. In nearly every instance, with one glaring exception, they were right. America profited from their insubordination. And this pattern of insurgency has been ignored by historians. You'll run across an anecdote or two in a text on, say, John Jay in the Revolutionary War, or Walter Hines Page in World War I, but no one has attempted a generalized inquiry into this perennial obstreperousness. And such inattention is surprising given the contrast between America's record and that of other countries. Diplomats representing other nations rarely displayed comparable defiance. The idea of doing so would have struck many of them as ridiculous or even suicidal. Now, diplomatic rebelliousness is not entirely unheard of in other countries. It does happen every once in a very great while. We can talk about those instances in the Q&A if you want, but with nothing like the regularity with which it occurs in American history. And those other governments tend to be much less indulgent of the maverick diplomat's actions than does Washington. America's foreign representatives habitually step out of line. A book-length study of this behavior is vital because it bears on one of the most important questions of my field. Is there such a thing as a uniquely American foreign policy? Some diplomatic historians say no. Some say it at full-throated bellow. They argue that the United States behaves like any other great power internationally. It may be stronger and richer than the other global dynamos, but there is no real difference between how America will act and how, say, China will act if placed in comparable circumstances. The same factors that drive Chinese behavior in the international arena drive U.S. behavior, the desire for security and or capital, depending on whom you ask. Others argue to the contrary that there are certain foreign policy watersheds, notably the Wilsonian crusade to make the world safe for democracy in World War I, and the later ill-contrived interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, that do not conform to the tenets of realpolitik or world systems theory, and that grew out of idiosyncratic strains in American culture, like evangelism, racism, or hubris. This debate has gone on for a long time and will, I'm sure, persist well into the future, but disputants have thus far neglected the vital dimension of protocol. It's a dull-sounding word, but it has great significance. It refers, at least in part, to permissible, even conceivable, self-direction on the part of the diplomat. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov attended the 1948 Paris Conference on the Marshall Plan, he would not answer the most innocuous questions without first telephoning his boss, Joseph Stalin, for direction. And although his leash was admittedly shorter than that of most diplomats, it was closer to what we might call standard length than the free rein granted to, or rather assumed by, US statesmen like Benjamin Franklin, James Monroe, and many of their successors. And while, as I noted a second ago, insurgent diplomacy is not completely unknown in other nations, I think it's fair to say that no non-American diplomat ever responded to a notice of dismissal the way envoy Nicholas Trist did when President James K. Polk fired him in October of 1847. Trist, then negotiating with a moderate Mexican faction to end America's first major military intervention abroad, flung down the president's dispatch and announced his intention to finish what he'd started. No, I'm not fired, I'm staying right here. And the result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, whereby Mexico relinquished all claims to Texas north of the Rio Grande and ceded an imperial domain that ultimately formed the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. American diplomats have always been a non-compliant group, and this has, for the most part, been a very good thing for the United States. The United States would have been worse off, weaker, smaller, poorer, and less secure had men like Trist not broken ranks. Now, this claim entails counterfactual reasoning, which is sometimes taboo among historians, but less of a problem here because more often than not, the superior officer whose instructions went unheeded himself acknowledged that the undutiful diplomat had obtained the best possible result. Occasionally, as when former President and Special Envoy Jimmy Carter averted a bloodbath in Haiti and restored its elected leader to power, the White House took credit for policies it had earlier opposed. Not all presidents or secretaries of state were so brazen, but none of them ever attempted to undo the handiwork of their mutinous underlings. Even Polk, who bent every effort to destroy Trist's reputation after the latter returned from Mexico, privately admitted that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo met or exceeded all of Washington's war aims. Had Trist accepted his ouster and come home without completing negotiations, the Mexican government, whose foothold was shaky, would have fallen, and Mexico would have descended into anarchy. The United States would then have been confronted with the prospect of a prolonged guerrilla resistance, and the House of Representatives, recently captured by the anti-war Whigs, would almost certainly have blocked further appropriations for America's armies in the field. By disobeying his commander-in-chief's instructions, Trist prevented national disaster and played an indispensable role in securing one of the greatest territorial acquisitions in U.S. history. Although shabbily rewarded for his far-sighted efforts, he might have taken solace in the words of John Adams, one of the original rogue diplomats, who, after joining John Jay and Benjamin Franklin in Paris for the final round of negotiations concluding the Revolutionary War, was disgusted to learn that the Continental Congress had ordered its peace commissioners to make no overtures to Great Britain unless America's ally, France, approved. Aware that the French foreign minister sought to coup into the United States east of the Appalachians, and certain that he could persuade war-weary British agents to agree to the Mississippi River as a western boundary, Adams ignored Congress's directive and told his cohorts, quote, "It is glory to have broken such infamous orders," end quote. As I said, I examined 6 instances of US diplomats acting on that principle. We can talk about any one of those case studies afterwards, or all of them if you like, but for the rest of my time today, I want to confront the question that I'm sure has occurred to you. Why? Why do America's diplomats so regularly flout orders? What is it about the American historical experience that has encouraged this kind of insubordination? And I think we have to pay attention to the attitude toward professional diplomacy expressed by the founding fathers and translated by them and their successors into the apparatus through which foreign policy is conducted. Here I'll become possibly the 1 millionth American historian to cite the novelist John Dos Passos's famous and possibly apocryphal pronouncement, quote, "Rejection of Europe is what America is all about," end quote. Well, one European institution that Americans emphatically rejected was old world diplomacy, the Foreign Service. Several historians, Bradford Perkins and Frederick Marx to name 2, have demonstrated that the framers of the Constitution did not want or expect the United States to plunge deeply into traditional diplomacy. Even strong nationalists like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton thought the United States should never have more than 4 or 5 representatives abroad. Others wanted fewer. Some of the framers felt the United States should never send any representatives abroad, and that other nations should be required to send envoys to America whenever there was anything to negotiate. And throughout the late 18th and most of the 19th century, the most often expressed legislative opinion about our representation abroad was that it should be smaller, not bigger. Even though America's interests internationally were expanding, the House of Representatives repeatedly passed resolutions to reduce the number of diplomatic missions. In 1832, it resolved that the United States should have no more than 3 ministers abroad, in England, France, and Russia. The rest should be eliminated. That measure was never adopted, but it had a lot of support on the grounds of economy, which is always a prime concern, and because of what diplomacy allegedly did to the Americans who engaged in it. And this latter concern was, I think, more important. It is impossible to exaggerate how negatively the first 5 or 6 generations of Americans viewed the practice of diplomacy. This was not an attitude that merely distinguished the founding generation. For a long time, Americans tended to view diplomacy as an evil and not even as a necessary evil. They felt that diplomacy made people effete, aristocratic, and unproductive. In a word, un-American. Engaging in diplomacy risked contaminating the American character. And the vehemence, even fanaticism, with which this view was held by many Americans is a subject that has not, I submit, received anywhere near the attention it merits in scholarship on U.S. foreign policy. If you read the standard textbooks on U.S. foreign policy, the 1 or 2 volume surveys by historians like Samuel Flagg Bemis, Thomas Bailey, George Herring, Howard Jones, Michael Hunt, Walter Lefebvre, Joyce Kaufman, and Armin Rappaport, you'll note they don't really address this subject, and they certainly don't point out how starkly it contrasted with popular views of diplomacy in other countries. Let me just note that the members of the Continental Congress were so concerned about the possibility of Europe corrupting the Republican simplicity of American representatives that a resolution was passed permitting the diplomats to remain abroad on their commissions for a period of only 3 years. Then they had to come home and be culturally deloused, as it were. John Quincy Adams agreed with this policy, even though, ironically, he himself served abroad for much longer periods of time. Indeed, he was one of the few Americans who could literally claim to have made diplomacy a career in the early 19th century. When he was James Monroe's Secretary of State, he declared, quote, "Ministers, after a few years abroad, need to be renovated by the wholesome Republican atmosphere of their own country," end quote. And that point was stated more pungently by a Southern congressman in 1839 during Martin Van Buren's administration, quote, "Our diplomatic agents return with their heads as full of kings, queens, and knaves as a pack of cards, so emasculated by the intercourse with royalty as to forget that they represent a nation of simple Republicans," end quote. 20 years later, Representative Jabez Curry of Alabama said of the machinery of diplomacy, quote, "Here is the evil, the fungus, the excrescence, a pinchbeck imitation of the pomp and pageantry of royalty, and we should put the knife to it and cut it out," end quote. And 30 years after that, on the eve of America's war with Spain and its first formal acquisition of overseas colonies, Senator William Robinson of New York proclaimed, quote, "The diplomatic service is working our ruin by creating desire for foreign customs and foreign follies. The disease is imported by our returning diplomats and by the foreign ambassadors sent here by monarchs and despots to corrupt and destroy our American ideals. They should both be quarantined as we quarantine foreign rags through fear of cholera," end quote. So diplomacy was not a profession or an avocation held in terribly high regard for most of United States history. And not only was diplomacy considered somewhat shady, many prominent Americans argued that it was unnecessary, a luxury. European nations had foreign services because they needed diplomats to soothe their mutual jealousies, work out their complicated alliances, calibrate and recalibrate the balance of power, agree on whose grandnephew got to control the Duchy of Pomerania, etc. But Americans didn't concern themselves with such nonsense. If we don't have to deal with these matters, why do we need representatives abroad? To facilitate commerce? We don't need a full-time diplomat for that. Just make the appropriate treaty and come home. And that was indeed a very persuasive and popular argument for a long stretch of time. Many Americans believed that treaties were the only tangible products of foreign intercourse, and the only treaties they were interested in were treaties of commerce. They also expected those treaties to be more or less self-operating, so they saw no need whatsoever for extensive continuous diplomacy. All you needed was a representative to negotiate the treaties. The ideal person would be a special agent commissioned by Congress, sent to carry out a specific task, and then return to the United States. That would be much cheaper than a permanent diplomatic post, and much more in keeping with Republican principles. Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of the Treasury under John Adams, once famously suggested, quote, "If we want any business abroad, give some good fellow a letter of attorney and let him do it," end quote. Over 120 years later, when relations between countries were much more complex, Champ Clark, Speaker of the House of Representatives, could still argue that full-time diplomatic representation was unnecessary, that, quote, it would be better to withdraw the entire diplomatic corps as a general thing, and then when we need a representative at a foreign court, whenever we have need for anyone to attend to these delicate duties, pick out a man of the highest capacity in this country and pack him off for a few months, end quote. At least Clark's expression, these delicate duties, could be construed to encompass matters of war and peace, not just economic affairs. That went above the mental ceiling of many 19th century and early 20th century American politicians who continue to believe that the United States' interaction with other countries was and would always be predominantly commercial in nature. When they thought, wrote, and spoke about foreign relations, about foreign policy, they thought, wrote, and spoke in financial, profit-making terms. None of the activities that people in other nations reflectively associated with foreign policy, forging or maintaining alliances, avoiding or limiting wars, annexing or surrendering territory and people, struck Americans as terribly important. These are matters that concern those wicked old world countries. They have no relevance for us, and therefore we have no need of diplomacy. It's instructive, I think, to contrast the development of America's military and diplomatic establishments. The Constitution provided not only for raising an army and a navy, but also for naming ambassadors, ministers, and consuls. And the American military quickly developed a professional structure at West Point in 1802 and the Naval Academy in 1845. Military service became for many ambitious young men an attractive career. American diplomacy, however, remained a part-time, essentially amateur affair for generations. Americans' virulent, long-standing distaste for professional statecraft and the concomitant doubts about its very utility led Congress to starve America's diplomatic institutions of funding, with the result that the United States contrived and maintained a first line of defense considerably more aristocratic and class-based than the foreign representation fielded by Britain, Spain, and other ostensibly decadent monarchical powers. This may be the ultimate example of the law of unintended consequences in U.S. foreign policy, which, believe me, is saying a very great deal. Ironic does not begin to describe the outcome of the various attempts to ensure that American foreign policy reflected American frugality and unpretentiousness. George Washington's administration, setting a precedent that future administrations would emulate, refused to appoint ambassadors. That was a rank associated with European royalty. It had no place in a republic. My students are always astonished to learn that the United States did not have an ambassador officially accredited to a foreign government until 1893, when Grover Cleveland was president. The nation existed for over a century without any diplomatic representative of the highest grade. Perhaps the most notorious instance of Americanizing the United States' foreign representation occurred in 1853, when Franklin Pierce's Secretary of State, William Marcy, issued his famous dress circular ordering American diplomats to, quote, appear at formal court functions in the simple dress of an American citizen, end quote. Marcy had no patience with what he called, quote, the gold braid and ostrich feathers of a effete monarchy's diplomatic livery, end quote. What seems not to have occurred to these architects of U.S. foreign policy is that no matter what an American diplomat's formal title was, and regardless of what kind of clothes he was permitted to wear, if he was not compensated for his service, or if he was paid a mere pittance, then his job was out of reach for all but the wealthiest Americans. For 80 years after the Declaration of Independence, America's foreign representatives scarcely drew salaries. They were expected to dip into private fortunes to pay for housing, food, transportation, clerical help, and entertainment. As a result, only wealthy men or men intending to serve for a very short time could afford to accept foreign appointments. Thomas Jefferson drew heavily upon his private fortune while he was U.S. representative to Paris, and he ultimately went bankrupt as a result of his diplomatic expenses. John C. Calhoun was offered the top diplomatic post in both London and Paris, but he turned both offers down, not because he didn't want the assignments, but because he couldn't afford them. As he explained, his private fortune would not stand the cost. And the same conditions obtained during Woodrow Wilson's administration, when Charles Eliot, a former president of Harvard, and Richard Olney, a former Secretary of State, refused ambassadorial appointments on financial grounds. To cite a revealing figure from an arbitrarily chosen block of time, from 1888 to 1906, over 60% of America's ministers for whom information on higher education is obtainable were graduates of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Less than 12% graduated from state universities. Selden Chapin, U.S. Minister to the Netherlands during the William Howard Taft administration, estimated that 99% of his colleagues had independent incomes. In the course of my research, I ran across a marvelous passage in the memoirs of William Sands, who headed the U.S. legation in Seoul during Theodore Roosevelt's first term. Quote, I felt that it was hardly respectable not to be on easy terms with presidents and secretaries of state. Had not presidents from Grant on been frequent and informal visitors at my grandfather's house, except, of course, for Chester Arthur, who was not approved of and not received, end quote, a man with this background and this outlook, was likely to regard an overseas exotic post as nothing more than his due, rather than as the longed-for culmination of decades of exemplary service, and to accept this diplomatic assignment for one of three reasons, or a combination of those reasons. One, because he felt that spending a few months in Korea would be an interesting adventure. Two, because becoming a minister was an effective way of advertising his membership in the upper class. I am rich enough to take on this job. I don't need to earn a salary like other people. Indeed, I am so wealthy that I can afford to transport myself and my family to the other side of the planet, rent and furnish a handsome home and offices, pay the salaries of numerous clerks, interpreters, messengers, and housekeepers, and host lavish receptions several times a week in my country of assignment without putting undue strain on my finances. I am clearly a considerable person. Or three, because he believed he could make a real difference in a vital area at a time of crisis, because he saw this as an opportunity to spare his country great misfortune or secure for his country a benefit that might never again be in reach. He would tend to interpret presidential instructions as friendly suggestions from a peer, rather than as inflexible orders from the commander-in-chief. He would not hesitate before bending or breaking those instructions if he felt they did not correspond to Asian realities as he interpreted them, and he would not expect to be dressed down for his behavior. And if he were dressed down, he might well resign. After all, it wasn't as though he's profiting financially from his position. He had almost certainly accepted the job with the understanding that he would not be doing it for an extended period. It was regarded as an interim experience and not a career. America's diplomatic representatives did not stay long at their posts. Jules Jusserand, the French minister in Washington, was in his nation's foreign service for 26 years before accepting his American assignment, and he was Paris's top diplomatic representative in the United States for 23 years during the Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge administrations. No American diplomat of that period had a comparable resume. This feature of American diplomacy, the financial qualification, engendered a certain amount of ill will on the part of journalists, pundits, and other molders of popular opinion. If you skim through magazines from the Gilded Age, publications like The Outlook, The Nation, Harper's Weekly, The North American Review, The Century, The Forum, The Review of Reviews, you'll find that there aren't many articles or editorials dealing with diplomacy, but that those which do address this subject inveigh against the so-called white spat brigade, the pink tea types, the cookie pushers, and so on. My favorite example of this is in 1889 Harper's editorial. It declared, quote, "The diplomatic service is a costly humbug and a sham. It is a nurse of snobs. It spoils a few Americans every year and does no good to anybody. Instead of making plenipotentiaries, Congress should wipe out the entire diplomatic service, abolish our foreign ministers, recall our farcical diplomats," end quote. In the 19th century writings of Henry Adams, Richard Harding Davis, O. Henry, and others, the pompous, overprivileged ambassador was a popular stereotype. Diplomacy's image in the United States also suffered from another factor, one intimately bound up with wealth as the standard of appointment. This was the spoils system, which further undermined the reputation of American diplomacy and which made a diplomatic career virtually impossible in the United States. As in other areas of American government, rotation in office influenced U.S. diplomacy, especially between 1829 and 1860, when there were frequent shifts in the power among the parties. For a long time, many U.S. representatives abroad were temporary political appointees. Presidents didn't think that basing diplomatic appointments on political considerations would compromise America's interests. They didn't believe that any government job required such extensive training as could not be acquired in the briefest period, and that view extended to diplomacy. Diplomatic posts should go to the party faithful, especially if they've drawn from their deep pockets at election time. In John Watson Foster's memoirs, there's a wild anecdote that demonstrates just how cavalier American presidents and secretaries of state were in dispensing overseas posts to wealthy donors. John Watson Foster was the grandfather of John Foster Dulles, a rich lawyer and a major contributor to Republican causes. He notes that he was given the choice of ministerships by President Ulysses Grant for his help in bringing Indiana into the Republican column in 1868. He chose Japan because he'd always wanted to visit there. But then he was approached by John Bingham, a former Republican congressman from Ohio, whom Grant had made minister to Mexico. Bingham said he didn't want to go to Mexico. He felt it was too hot, and he asked Foster to swap ministerships. Foster said, okay, and they swapped. Grant did not object to their trade. Needless to say, neither man spoke Spanish or Japanese. This stood in stark contrast to the policies of other nations where candidates for diplomatic service had to pass qualifying examinations, entered the service at its lowest rank, were promoted on the basis of merit, and usually remained in the service until they reached a compulsory retirement age. And I think it's telling that the drive for civil service reform that swept through the United States at the end of the 19th century left American diplomacy more or less untouched. The Pendleton Act and other important pieces of legislation weren't applied to diplomacy. There, the spoils system survived well into the Woodrow Wilson administration and throughout the end of the First World War. This was still the manner in which U.S. foreign policy was conducted long after other areas of American government had undergone substantial reform. And there was very little public sentiment for professionalizing the ranks of U.S. diplomacy by establishing a system of promotion by merit or security of tenure, while Americans could work up a tremendous amount of enthusiasm about other efforts to make the American economic or political system fairer. Antitrust laws, income taxes, women's suffrage, the initiative, referendum, and recall, diplomacy did not engage their interest. And when congressmen did bestir themselves to take the politics out of American foreign policy, their initial efforts were overwhelmingly directed toward the consular service, not the diplomatic service. Consuls were considered much more important than diplomats. They were the ones who, in popular opinion, did real work. They promoted trade and commerce. Indeed, the 1924 Rogers Act, which finally gave the United States an official foreign service, was designed principally to improve America's consular representation. And for all the fanfare that attended its passage, the Rogers Act had a limited impact on American diplomacy. For one thing, while a salary scale was implemented for diplomatic officers on 9 separate levels of seniority, it was still woefully inferior to the salary paid to diplomats of an equivalent rank in other countries. The first secretary of the British embassy in, for example, Paris, still made over 3 times as much as the first secretary of the American embassy. As before, almost anyone who wanted the privilege of serving the United States abroad had to be a wealthy man willing to pay out of his own pocket. And the exam requirement did provide a facade of a level playing field, but only a facade. Taking the examination required considerable capital expenditure beyond the means of most would-be candidates. It was necessary to travel to Washington, for one thing. That alone could be prohibitively expensive. Then you had to pass the exam. If you were rich, you could hire a tutor. Some candidates did. And the oral half of the exam had no formal procedures. Examiners evaluated candidates on the basis of vague but obviously classist categories like character, disposition, personality, discretion, and address. So given these factors, it was relatively easy for the diplomatic branch to preserve its exclusivity. Also, and most important, while the entire consular branch was established on a merit basis, promotion by merit in the diplomatic service stopped below the level of ambassador. Diplomatic officers of the highest rank could still be appointed for reasons other than demonstrated merit over a long tenure of service. They could still be rank amateurs, and indeed, most of them were. Another act intended to democratize and professionalize the U.S. Foreign Service, the 1931 Moses-Linthicum Act, removed some of the barriers, keeping non-wealthy Americans out, and overhauled the examination process to a degree, but retained the principle of stopping the promotional ladder below the highest level and erecting a ceiling over the service, past which only special cases could go. Career men might be appointed ambassadors if the country in question was not deemed terribly important, or if it was such a notorious hardship post that few officers wanted to serve there. But when it came to the crucial nations, nations whose conduct with respect to the United States could seriously jeopardize American physical and economic security, the ambassador was almost always a non-career man who did not owe his appointment to merit recruitment and promotion. In the fateful period leading up to U.S. co-belligerency in World War II, nearly all of Franklin Roosevelt's ambassadors in vital nations were amateurs. Joseph P. Kennedy, millionaire investor and movie mogul in London. Jesse Strauss, millionaire retail magnate and a major contributor to Roosevelt's 1932 election campaign in Paris. Claude Bowers, author and Democratic publicist in Madrid. Josephus Daniels, millionaire newspaper publisher in Mexico City. William Dodd, historian and Democratic publicist in Berlin. Only our ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, was a career diplomat. And these non-career ambassadors conceived their missions differently than did the professional representatives of other countries. One line that I find particularly evocative of the traditional non-American perspective was uttered by a British Foreign Service officer who declared, quote, "We consider ourselves as little more than pens in the hands of the government at home," end quote. That is not how a man like Josephus Daniels felt about his job in Mexico. First of all, like most of the rogue diplomats I studied, he was rich. He didn't accept his ambassadorship for the salary. Second, he was over 70 years old and in fragile health when Roosevelt tapped him for the post. He didn't expect to serve for long as ambassador. From his vantage point, he was selflessly working for his country's interests in a none too hospitable place at a time when most American men of his age and attainments were enjoying a well-deserved retirement. Like Henry Cabot Lodge II, he had not gone abroad to be anybody's errand boy, least of all Secretary of State Cordell Hull's. Indeed, Daniels thought that Hull was mediocre and unimaginative. So when Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized Mexico's petroleum industry and Hull cabled Daniels the text of a protest note instructing the ambassador to deliver it to Cárdenas at once, Daniels refused. Daniels argued that an American reprimand would destroy the good neighbor policy and drive Mexico into Adolf Hitler's arms. Hull, furious, ordered Daniels to present the cable without delay. He also directed the ambassador to return to the United States upon completion of this task. Withdrawal of an ambassador was a signal of Washington's displeasure. Also, at least one historian has argued that Hull was essentially telling Daniels, "You are fired." Again, Daniels refused. Shades of Nicholas Trist. "No, I'm not fired. I'm staying right here." And Daniels ultimately read Cardenas a severely watered-down version of Hull's message and told the Mexican president that it should not be regarded as a formal diplomatic communication from Washington. It was just an unofficial expression of Secretary Hull's views. E. David Cronin, who's the most astute analyst of Daniels' service in Mexico, concludes that, quote, "the ambassador's actions were clearly insubordinate. He had no authority to do what he did," end quote. But Cronin deems Daniels' performance heroic. Interviews with former members of the Cardenas government convinced Cronin that, quote, "Mexico would have broken diplomatic relations if Ambassador Daniels had presented the note officially," end quote. And the ramifications of such a rupture can be imagined. Mexican defection from the Hemispheric Alliance would have been a godsend to the fascists, especially if Hitler had succeeded in gaining access to Mexican oil, a resource vital to U.S. defense interests. In Cronin's view, quote, "Daniels almost single-handedly prevented a break between the United States and Mexico," end quote. That verdict is borne out by the fact that the Cardenas government did break relations with Great Britain when British Ambassador Owen Sinclair O'Malley, as per his instructions from the Foreign Office, demanded a return of confiscated oil properties. Alas for London, it had an obedient diplomat in Mexico City. Since World War II, there have been two major legislative renovations of the U.S. Foreign Service, the Foreign Service Act of 1946 and the Foreign Service Act of 1980. Both brought about significant reforms in the service, but one feature of the service that has remained constant is the inapplicability of those reforms to the highest level of diplomatic representation, the ambassadors. There, the United States is still, even today, represented by non-career men and women who owe their appointments to factors other than their previously documented fitness to discharge diplomatic duties. Joseph Whipple, a professor of international relations at Boston University, recently published a piece in the Globe lamenting this fact, observing, quote, "The United States is the only country in the world where a substantial number of ambassadorships are held by political appointees," end quote. And as has been the case throughout their history, Americans don't, as a rule, seem to get terribly exercised about this. Americans remain ambivalent about diplomacy, in contrast to other professions like, say, the military. It's hard to imagine the American people tolerating the high number of four-star generals and admirals being named from the ranks of campaign contributors, even in peacetime. But diplomacy, as always, appears to be a special case. Now, the practice of appointing non-career men and women to ambassadorships is not entirely unique to the United States. It happens in other countries too, but with nothing like the frequency with which it happens here, and it usually happens for different reasons. We can discuss that in the Q&A if you want. At the time I first conceived Rogue Diplomats as a project, Caroline Kennedy was gearing up to become U.S. ambassador to Japan, despite the fact that she did not speak Japanese and possessed no special knowledge of Asia. What she did have, like several of the rogue diplomats I studied, was a measure of celebrity, a personal fortune, numerous vocational and avocational opportunities and interests outside of the diplomatic sphere, and at least a vague apprehension that the president owed her rather than the other way around. I'm sure she was aware of the pundits who whispered that her 2008 endorsement of Barack Obama gave his candidacy the credibility and legitimacy it was lacking. From what I knew of Caroline Kennedy, I thought it was unlikely that her tenure in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo would be a replay of her grandfather's bull in a China shop ambassadorship in London, but she would be operating under conditions similar to those that obtained for Joseph P. Kennedy when he tried to hijack U.S. foreign policy in the late 1930s. And she would be just as unwilling as he was to serve as a pen in the hands of the government at home, a passive diplomatic conduit. She would expect to be a major player, not bound by the same constraints that would inhibit a career diplomat. She would feel much freer than diplomats from other countries to articulate, in her own fashion, of course, that sentiment so unimprovably expressed by Foreign Service Officer William Watts in 1970. Watts was not an ambassador. He wasn't even serving overseas. He was staff secretary of the National Security Council during Richard Nixon's first term. But this episode is so priceless that I've decided to close with it anyway. When Watts learned from National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger about Nixon's plans to use American ground forces in an invasion of Cambodia, he objected to this blatant violation of Cambodian neutrality. Kissinger famously admonished him, quote, "We are all the president's men," end quote. Watts then threatened to resign in protest, whereupon Alexander Haig, Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, declared, quote, "You cannot disobey a direct order from your commander-in-chief," end quote. To which the rogue diplomat responded, quote, "Fuck you, Al. I just did," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth, for this fascinating talk. That was excellent. So I will kick us off with the question and answers. Just to let everybody know that you can submit questions. Just do it through the chat box. So our first question is: did the diplomats play any role in misleading the American public on the Vietnam War?
That's a really good question. Henry Cabot Lodge II is one of my rogue diplomats during his service in Vietnam. He was unusually candid about the deterioration of the No Diem regime in Saigon, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't adopt the happy face line taken by the John F. Kennedy administration. But I think yes, I think Frederick Knowlton, who preceded Lodge as ambassador to South Vietnam, definitely misled the American people with regard to the situation in Vietnam. And people after Lodge, people like Elbridge Durbrow or other people who served as our ambassador in Saigon, did try to present as rosy a picture as possible, and to the point where they, in fact, did misinform the American people, and I think brought little honor to their country.
Thank you. And then I've got a second question that is, what inspired you to write Rogue Diplomats?
Oh, what inspired me to write that? It's funny, this is my fourth book, but it's the first one that grew out of teaching. I've been teaching at Boston College for 20 years. This is the first one of my books that grew out of a class. I teach this year-long survey of U.S. foreign policy. Now, I started noticing a while ago that students sat up a little straighter, paid a little more attention when I addressed those instances in which American diplomats stepped out of line. I had students gasp at some of the bluntness of John Adams's correspondence in the Diplomacy Ending the Revolutionary War. Nicholas Trist's correspondence actually got a round of applause when I read that in class once, and Trist would have appreciated that. He was kind of a drama queen. And finally, as the Boston College's bright students are wont to do, a young woman asked me, did other nations have this problem with their diplomats? And I couldn't answer that question, and I was also kind of struck by the fact that she used the word problem, since, I think we did pretty well at the end of the American Revolution and the Mexican War and the Louisiana Purchase. So I posted, I went on HDiplo, which is kind of the website for diplomatic historians, and I asked, do other nations have this pattern of rebelliousness in their diplomatic service? And I got a chorus of no's. Apparently, the only nation that appoints as many non-career diplomats as the United States does is the Philippines. That's it. Most other nations do not appoint non-career people, or when they do, it's for reasons that are very different than those in the United States, and they're also much less tolerant of that diplomat's behavior than Washington is.
Great, thank you. I have another question in, which is, can you comment upon the fall of Diem in November '63? Do you think his ouster was inevitable?
Oh boy, see, my first two books are about Diem, and also he's the subject of chapter 6 in my book. I do not agree with the argument that's been deployed by a couple of people that Diem, for all of his faults, was the best leader that South Vietnam could have had. We should have stuck with him, and if we had stuck with him, that we would have, won the war. I don't agree with that. I think his support base was degrading, not increasing at the time he was assassinated. I think on the basis of the transcripts I've read of interviews with Diem, that he may not have been crazy, but he was seriously mentally deteriorated at that point, I think. I don't think that if we'd stuck with him that the war would have had a happier conclusion. I do think the United States has blood on its hands in the assassination of Diem. John F. Kennedy claimed to have been rushed from the room in horror when he heard news of it, and it never occurred to him that this would have had a violent outcome. I find that impossible to believe. John F. Kennedy was a very smart guy. I think we helped engineer the overthrow of Diem, and even though we didn't specifically say, kill him, we also didn't say don't kill him. So it was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of U.S. foreign policy, that's basically my view. A number of people disagree. Mark Moyar has published a book with the same press, Triumph Forsaken, thinks Diem was a great statesman, the equivalent of South Vietnam's George Washington. And Mark Moyar is a pretty smart guy. So this is an issue on which historians have crossed swords, and they will continue to do so in the future.
Thank you. I have another slightly longer question, so bear with me while I read it out.
Okay.
It is, Did ambassadors cultivate working environments that supported their independent agendas? I.e., can we see some echoes of Otter's Foreign Office mind, wherein policies and behaviours within the embassy coalesced behind the ambassador, perhaps in conflict with the State Department?
I can think of one case where that definitely was the situation. That was Walter Hines Page when he headed up Embassy London in the years before America became involved in World War I. He did a really good job. I mean, he disagreed with President Woodrow Wilson. He disagreed with Wilson's first Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. He disagreed with the second Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. He disagreed with Wilson's most closest friend and informal advisor, Colonel Edward House. He's basically swimming against the tide in Washington, but he did create a situation where everybody, or almost everybody at the embassy in London, believed, along with him, that the United States must get involved in World War I, that the British were on the side of righteousness. And that was one of the reasons why Wilson couldn't fire Page, because Colonel House said to him, look, if you fire Page, we're going to have to fire the entire embassy. He's infected them with his delusions. Well, they weren't delusions, he was right. I don't know about the other instances in American diplomatic history, but that's one case where basically he's created a situation where, you know, it's us against Washington. And that attitude was widespread in the American embassy at the time.
Next question, to what extent did attenuated communication and travel networks in the late 18th and 19th centuries lead to a pattern of independent actions by US diplomats?
That's an excellent question, and actually that's a point that I mentioned in the introduction of my book that Bradford Perkins has pointed out, American diplomatic rebelliousness. I'm not the first person to notice this. He published an article back in the 80s, and he was talking about the American Revolution, so-called quasi-war, the Louisiana Purchase, and he basically ascribes American diplomats' disobedience to the breadth of the Atlantic. He notices that it took at least a month, and that's with good weather, for a message to get from Washington to Europe, and then you have to wait for a reply. So that necessitated ambassadors like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay freelancing while they were representing their nation in Paris, and resulted in James Monroe and Robert Livingston striking while the iron was hot and accepting the Louisiana Purchase, even though that meant violating their instructions, because Napoleon might have changed his mind, and they couldn't have waited for a response from Jefferson. The only problem with that argument, he's onto something, Perkins, is that diplomats remained just as disobedient after the cable was installed. In fact, they became just as disobedient when email was installed. One of the examples I don't use in my book, I don't devote a chapter to it, is Jimmy Carter, when he's Bill Clinton's representative in Haiti. I mean, getting storms of emails and calls over and over again, he's still just as disobedient as Adams, Jay, and Franklin. Also, another problem with Perkins's argument is that the European representatives in the United States were nowhere near as disobedient as their American counterparts, and it was just as far for them to get in touch with their home governments from the United States. They didn't display the same kind of rebelliousness. So you can't discount 3,000 miles of blue sea. That did play a role, but I think it's not the only role.
Thank you. We have another question for you, which is, you spoke about the social strata from which diplomats emerged, independently wealthy, elite educated, amongst American ambassadors. To what extent does that persist today?
It still persists today. I can give you an example. George Sunis, T-S-U-N-I-S, was Barack Obama's choice to be our ambassador to Norway. He had donated over $1 million to Obama's election campaign, and you know, he's a very wealthy guy. And he during his hearings before Congress, it turned out that he didn't know that a prime minister rather than a president headed the Norwegian government. He didn't know anything about Norwegian history. He just had deep pockets. He donated during campaign time. Jim Oberwetter, who was George W. Bush's ambassador in Saudi Arabia, didn't speak a word of Arabic, had never been to Saudi Arabia before, but had kicked in a lot of money for Bush's campaign. Carolyn Kennedy was a case that I mentioned at the end. There are an awful lot of cases I could note. And I'm blanking on his name right now, Timothy something or other. He's a former congressman. But when he heard that Obama wanted him to be ambassador to Turkey, I think it was, India. he basically said to the New York Times, I told President Obama I can't afford to take on a job like that. So the financial requirement is still very, very much there. Also, there's the political requirement too. Embassy Tokyo has been a political reward for, say, someone like Walter Mondale was made our ambassador to Tokyo after having spent 8 years in the political wilderness when Reagan became president. He was a party stalwart. He didn't speak any Japanese, didn't know anything about Japanese history, but the president felt that he deserved this as a political plum, so he gave it to him. And other nations don't do this. Like I said, other nations do sometimes appoint non-career men and women, but with nothing like the regularity that the United States. The United States is the only OECD country that even has this pattern of appointment. Other nations just don't.
We have another question. How do you interpret the efforts by US Ambassador John Kennedy Smith on the visa issue for this Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams during the Northern Ireland Troubles?
That is an excellent question for somebody else. I'm afraid I haven't studied that episode.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. And we also have one. So which of the 6 case studies you discuss in your book is your favorite?
My favorite.
Or which case study offered the most surprising story about a rogue diplomat?
That would definitely be Nicholas Trist in the Mexican War. The 3rd chapter of the book on Trist in the Mexican War is, I think, the best thing I've ever written. He was a joy to research. What a fascinating, maddening man with an incredible talent for self-sabotage, but eminently quotable. I loved writing that chapter. I think, and God bless Cambridge University Press. They didn't make me cut any of it. It was the longest chapter I've ever written, but I think you really needed every single sentence in there in order to get across just how outrageous and courageous and self-destructive Trist was. Of all the rogue diplomats that I researched, the one that is my counterexample, the one rogue diplomat who's freelancing was bad for the United States, is Joseph P. Kennedy. And I have to say, I've never disliked a historical subject that I've researched ever as much as Joseph P. Kennedy. I literally couldn't stand the man. I would finish my research at the Kennedy Library or at Bell and other archives just wanting to, scrub myself with janitor in a drum. I mean, he's just absolutely loathsome, odious person, very good at making money. But I mean, I remember there's a bunch of things that I ran across in the archives that I couldn't use in the book. Like, for example, his daughter, Rosemary, who was mentally impaired. He had her stationed with these nuns in Roehampton while he was an ambassador, and she would send him these letters in kind of childlike scrawl saying, "Dear Daddy, I'm so sorry I was fat the last time you saw me. I will be skinny the next time. I don't want to embarrass you." And there's a letter from a very young 19-year-old John F. Kennedy, who's just had his heart broken because he wants to marry this young woman, but he's a Catholic and her family won't allow it. And he sends this very, he's reaching out to the man he respects most in the world, his father. And Joseph P. Kennedy responds by saying, there was no crying in this family. If you ever send me another letter like that, I'll disown you. He's just a rotten person. He really is. And the fact that I'm Jewish and he was an inveterate anti-Semite didn't help either. So that chapter was tough to write. But the chapter on Trist was a delight to write.
Thank you. And then a question on, so during your research, did you come across any instances of non-American rogue diplomats that you'd like to touch on?
Yes, well, I'll give you a couple of examples. Back in the War of 1812, David Erskine was Great Britain's representative in the United States, and he had married an American woman. He was one of the few British diplomats at the time who really wanted to improve Anglo-American relations. He wanted to avoid a war. So he told President James Madison that Great Britain had lifted its orders in council on American shipping, which had been a source of a lot of friction between the two countries. For a couple of weeks, Madison lived in a fool's paradise. 600 American ships laden with two years of goods set sail for British ports. But the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, repudiated Erskine's statement. No, we haven't withheld the orders in council. We haven't repealed them. I'll be happy to accept all these American goods, but we haven't repealed those orders in council. And Erskine was fired. And for 30 years, he couldn't get another diplomatic appointment. Another example is this gentleman named Craig Murray, who was a British ambassador to Uzbekistan in the period immediately following 9/11. He disobeyed orders from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to make no statements to the media about the Karimov regime's human rights abuses, and he was fired. And he basically left the Foreign Service. And there was this other example that I wasn't aware of until I was told this by a friend of mine a little while ago. Israel had this guy, Elihu Sasson, who was the ambassador to Italy, was a back channel negotiator with the Turkish government. And the Turkish foreign minister, Rostу Zorlu, wanted Israel to help Turkey in toppling the government of Syria. And when David Ben-Gurion heard about this, he told Sasson, tell him no, absolutely not. We don't want to be involved in that kind of business. And Sasson refused to do that because he said, if I do that, he's going to break off communications between us. We'll have a rupture in diplomatic communications, and that's not good for Israel. And actually, the foreign minister, Golda Meir, thought he did the right thing. But David Ben-Gurion chewed him out, and he was fired.